Ladies and gentlemen, very welcome to yet another seminar organized by ISDP, the Institute for Security and Development Policy here in Stockholm. Today we're going to have as a topic what you can see on the screen here, meeting shared challenges, securing the liberal international order. And we have invited two speakers. One is Dr. Tsuruoka Michito, who is a professor from Keio University in Tokyo. The other one is Dr. John Hemmings, who is the director of the Asia Studies Center at the Henry Jackson Society in the UK. Two very distinguished speakers, and I would like to welcome them to the rostrum here, or to the podium, I would say. And I will ask the two speakers to begin with one statement each, maybe 15 minutes or so, and then perhaps comment on each other's speeches or statements. And then I think it will be time to open up for questions. We have lots of time for questions. So again, most welcome to this seminar, and I'm very happy to see you all here. So let's begin. And shall we begin with asking Dr. Tsuruoka to say a few.
It's on? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Ambassador. My name is Mr. Tsuruoka. I'm teaching at Keio University. I'm very delighted to be here this afternoon. This is very first time for me to visit this city, and I've walked around here, and this is really a beautiful city. I loved it. Today's topic, the meeting shared challenges and securing the liberal international order. This suggests that the current international order is under threat. But under threat by whom? That's a bit of a question, because some people say that the jungle growing back in the world order. This is the title of the Robert Kagan's book. But jungle growing back, yes, it's an interesting proposition. But what is quite important to be reminded is that the world has always been a jungle. But the United States has kindly kept the world safe for us for many, many years. Of course, we have been playing an important role in safeguarding, maintaining international order together with the Americans. But still, I think we can say that we have relied on the US quite a lot for many years. And so now, regardless of what Trump says and what Trump does, what I think is clear is that we need to do more. I mean, we means Europe, Japan, or other like-minded countries who have been benefiting quite a lot from the liberal or rules-based international order in the post-war period. So this debate, the burden sharing, this debate has been very much ignited by Mr. Trump, that's for sure. But even without Mr. Trump, it's quite legitimate, and it's quite reasonable, and it's quite needed for us to think about what we can do more. So I'm very still optimistic that we can save this world, and we can maintain this order, rules-based international order. Mainly because we are all benefiting from that. So that we have good reasons to be committed to safeguard, maintain, and preferably promote this international order. So I believe that Japan and the EU or Europe as a whole have a very big stakes, strategic stakes in maintaining this order, and that is why we have been trying to step up in terms of sharing more international responsibilities. So let me say a few words on what Japan has been doing, mainly because I'm from Japan, and I'm not representing the Japanese government here, but still, as someone they're looking at international relations, studying international relations in Japan, let me say a few words on what Japan has been doing. And first, it's that is to strengthen the alliance with the United States. So yes, the Mr. Trump is a new phenomenon, and it's a new factor that affects a lot of things. But still, seen from Japan, the United States is the only treaty ally that is committed to help defend Japan. So whether we like Mr. Trump as a person or not, whoever sits in the White House, that doesn't matter. The United States is the United States, and which is the only treaty ally for Japan. So the Prime Minister Abe has been committed to build a very good personal relationship with Mr. Trump. So they have played golf together for already 3 times, and that's quite an achievement. Of course, to what extent and whether that sort of personal rapport between the 2 leaders matters in terms of dealing with concrete policy items, that's what we don't know. And looking at the trade negotiations between the 2 countries, the people are getting more concerned about the direction of this relationship. But still, when it comes to security and defense, I would say that there's no plan B for Japan. So in terms of addressing threats from North Korea or the rise of China, the military expansion of China, and the assertive behaviors, particularly in the maritime domain, yes, of course, Japan is stepping up its own efforts, but it's just impossible for Japan to address those threats by its own without the alliance with the United States. So the fact that there's no plan B, it's just a reality. So, but of course, in that context as well, the Japan is trying to strengthen its own defense posture, and including the ballistic missile defense and other things. So that's the first pillar. And the second pillar, of course, is the Europe-Japan relations. Particularly, this is Stockholm, so I wanted to emphasize the importance of the EU-Japan partnership. So earlier this year, the 2 sides, Brussels and Tokyo, signed the EPA, the Economic Partnership Agreement, together with SPA, the Strategic Partnership Agreement. So many people talk a lot about EPA, but in terms of thinking about the maintaining international order, the SPA, the importance of SPA should not be overlooked. So it is about political cooperation and political security cooperation, and it covers a lot of areas. So the fact that we managed to sign those 2 agreements, that was strategically very important, because we managed to send a message that still the idea of free trade is alive, and also the idea of multilateral cooperation is also alive. So the strategic stakes for Europe-Japan and EU-Japan relationship has increased quite a lot. In part, of course, thanks to Mr. Trump. So now the people, including US media, are very much interested in what the EU and Japan are doing, which is a quite new phenomenon. And in the Asia-Pacific region, the pillar of what Japan is doing in terms of maintaining the rules-based international order is to advance the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now the US has left, sadly. So it's called the TPP-11, or more formally, it's called the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for TPP. It's a bit strange name, but the TPP-11 is something that it is also quite important in terms of a continuing our efforts to advance the cause of free trade and multilateral cooperation in trade. And also, it's also a strategic message to Americans as well, because we are there and you are always welcome to come back. That's the message. But of course, we are not that naive, so we know that it's highly, highly unlikely for the Trump administration to come back. But still, it's really important for us to keep encouraging Americans to come back to the role of international leadership. And the pillar is that the current Tokyo government has been doing is to expand the network of strategic partnerships with an increasing number of countries, including Australia, India, and various European countries, particularly big ones, the UK and France, when it comes to security and defense cooperation. So the Australia-India and the trilateral cooperation, or the four-country quadrilateral cooperation as well, involving the United States, Australia, India, or Japan, US, India, and this minilateral, or this small scale, the minilateral cooperation, multilateral cooperation is also taking place. And finally, not the least, is the Japan's engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So the free and open Indo-Pacific is something that the current government has been championing for some time. And it means that, of course, the Indo-Pacific is not just about the Indian Ocean or India per se. It is a broader concept covering both the Asia-Pacific region and the Indian Ocean region. But of course, the new element, of course, is for Japan to be more engaged in the Indian Ocean. So the bilateral relationship with India is something that Japan has been very much eager to develop, not just in the economic terms, but also in the security and defense terms as well. So including conducting various joint exercises, particularly maritime exercises, with bilateral, in the bilateral context between Japan and India, or also in the trilateral context together with Americans and Indians. So these are the things that Japan is doing. But coming back to the overall topic, overall theme of today's workshop, and securing liberal international order, then from whom we need to secure this order. And of course, there are countries which are prepared to change the status quo by force or coercion. And of course, many of you have two countries in your mind, and Russia and China, of course. And but the problem for us is that China and Russia are also part of the wider international community. So we have to live with them. And looking at the map of Asia, Japan sits just next to China. And we cannot move whether we like the country or not. And Russia as well. Looking at the map between Sweden and Japan, there are only two countries, the Finland and Russia. So we have to deal with those countries, whether we like it or not. So it's very easy and tempting for us to think that we need to defend rules-based international order from Russia and China. But I think it's a bit too simplistic argument, because we have to accommodate those countries as well. So in that context, what is really important for us to think about is where we can draw a line between what is acceptable and what is not acceptable regarding Chinese and Russian behaviors. So yes, the Russians and Chinese, they are doing good things as well. So where to draw a line, that's not an easy challenge for us. So I think I don't have any clear answer for that, but I think I believe that we need to be more specific, and we need to think more about what is acceptable and what is not. So in various contexts, in the context of this country, or in the EU context, or in the Japanese context, there are various things which we can accept, and also there are various things, perhaps increasingly, there are various things which we don't want to accept. So this is a bit irresponsible way of closing my talks, but this is something that I really would like you to think about. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Michito, for setting the tone for, I think, what is a really important debate and discussion. There's going to be overlap with what I say, but obviously I'll try to give a slight London perspective. I probably won't mention Brexit, so let's just say that now. Say the dreaded B word, and then let's just move forward. The way I have come to this topic is very similar to Michito, but also slightly different. I think after the Cold War, the Western liberal states began to really solidify the rules-based order, and create much more of its liberal character. So I distinguish between the rules-based system, which a lot of international legal and IGOs belong to, and the normative side, which came very much, I think, post-World War II and had a kind of human rights flavor and much more democracy flavored. So let's just distinguish between those two. Western states are on the back foot now. I think what we've seen is that in the 1990s, People's Republic of China and Russia were basically going through domestic turmoil. And once they consolidated, political will, they began to move forward on what they saw were their values. And the normative push of the Western alliance was just anathema to them. So what you have very much now is a contested rules-based order, and certainly the liberal nature of that is open to debate. And what you've seen as a result of that is you've seen a couple of different things happen which have complicated the situation. So we don't have just a kind of Empire Strikes Back type of moment where you have the neo-authoritarian powers fighting back and pushing their own order. You also have the hegemon, the US, unsure about globalization and pushing back on its own offshoring of manufacturing and its outsourcing to China of manufacturing. So and it's also a bit more under this particular government, more cynical about the international government organizations, many of which it established. So you have this tension from both sides. You have a tension from the actual system hegemon, and you also have a tension from Russia and the PRC, who found that the normative liberal push in the 1990s, that agenda was offensive to them, particularly when it came, in the Balkans and also on human rights for China. So 2014 is a pivotal moment. I think people will probably look back at 2014 with the island building in the South China Sea and the kind of quasi-invasion of Ukraine as those pivotal moments when Russia and China had developed enough strength to really push back at that order. And essentially what they began to do was, in very small salami-slice steps to kind of carve off parts of that order. They knew exactly where the threshold for the West was, and they would just pick off little pieces of that. And they've been extremely good at it, and the West was kind of caught unawares, partly captured by our own hubris and our own idea. But of course you want to be normatively liberal and part of the rules-based order. That was the Western dream all the way back to Francis Fukuyama. Of course you want to be like us. So as a result, South China Sea, which is a huge issue for Western trade, but still it's very far from Europe, became a kind of critical issue. And as the US in the 2000s began to fight its wars in the Middle East, the Pacific side began developing little mini-lateral alliances. Michito's mentioned already. And what you saw is like between US allies, they began to hook up. Smaller and medium-sized powers began to develop their own relationships. So, for example, UK and Japan have a 2+2. They do information sharing, lots of defense industrial pieces here and there. And they're not full allies, but they have little relationships. Japan led this way very much also with France, which has a 2+2 relationship. So what do these things mean? Are they just trying to develop better defense industrial capacity? Yes, but also what you're seeing is that as the system leader is disputing its own creation, as the Trump administration disputes the system, you have the kind of middle powers that have normally traditionally followed the US linking up with each other and trying to find their own way. The US administration, I wouldn't say, is anti-system. My argument has always been that the Trump administration would prefer that everything after 1990 be dismantled. They're full Reaganists. They like the manufacturing at home. I think if you look at the liberal US approach towards foreign policy up to Reagan, you can see that's very much in sympathy with what Trump is doing. That's my philosophy, my interpretation. For example, there's a kind of, I'd say, a cynicism about international government organizations. Remember the hubris and the kind of faith that we had was at highest in the 1990s. I think the Trump administration is also putting more into its alliances. This sounds wrong because they've been questioning them, but actually they've been sending more resources towards those alliances. They've just been asking for more from the alliances. They've been asking for more money from NATO spenders, and they've been asking for more activity in the Asia-Pacific region. Trump himself is not very good at all this stuff, but behind the scenes, you have the kind of Secretary of Defense Mattis is very much in the old Reagan tradition, I think. So where does the UK come in all this? You know, aside from thinking about Brexit, which I admit takes up very much of our bandwidth, it's a kind of unusual, interesting situation for Britain. After all, we played a significant intellectual role in the creation of many of the rules system. I mean, we were there at the signing of San Francisco of the UN system. We have a lot of intellectual input in that. We also played a major contributing role to the creation of NATO. Maritime law, you don't have to think far to think about the British contribution to that. So Britain does have interest, and if you look through government approaches at the moment and the global Britain policy espoused by Theresa May, you do see that there is a very active articulation of defending the rules-based international system. And this is partially because we have been messaged very strongly by regional countries and allies like Australia and Japan and Singapore and Commonwealth members that are concerned about some of the activities they see China doing in Asia, which strike them as more power-based rather than rules-based. So the UK has found itself adrift, maybe after 60 years of being a transatlantic power, being a power focused on security in Europe. We now find ourselves approaching perhaps a new destiny, which might bring us towards the Indo-Pacific. I say that with a good dose of cynicism, even as I say the words, but if we think about it, the British are very well placed to be a maritime nation. As trade is set to increase, maritime trade will be continuing to go up from the 90% it is already. Furthermore, we see something like the global middle class will double by 2050, and most of that will be around the Indian Ocean region. So you have all these newly enriched people needing products and energy from the Middle East. Britain would like to be a part of that trade. So there's definitely a kind of geopolitical reason for the UK to look towards Asia. But we also have to think about what are the neo-authoritarian powers doing closer to home. And for us, of course, Russia has been the defining feature. So China and Indo-Pacific aside, that's all about number 3 or even 4 on our list of things to do. We've had, the poisoning, the Skripal poisoning, and we've had a number of different incidences which show that Russian influence is very high. Our think tank produced a report recently that showed that the number of spies, according to Russian diaspora in London, is higher than it was in 1985 at the height of the Cold War. Now, you can dispute that figure, but the fact that we're at such a number again is quite shocking. There's also, to some extent, China has come to Britain. When Theresa May fought back on the Hinkley Point nuclear power plant, which would be done in conjunction with a Chinese company and a French company, when she asked for added security guarantees, the Chinese made it very clear that this was unacceptable and that further investment into the UK might be a prisoner to that. So there's a very serious issue that we have an authoritarian power that's also becoming the global provider of foreign direct investment. And if you need infrastructure development, as we do in Indo-Pacific and as we do in the UK, then you have to deal with China. But you also have to deal with the consequences of a neo-authoritarian state, building a social credit system, buying data cloud centers in our countries, buying and providing digital infrastructure through Huawei, one of its primary companies. Is our data going to be safe? I've heard of, even today, I've heard some Europeans now are on the social credit system. They have a file, they have a number. Is that going to be extended to all of us? If I speak more critically of China, will my number go down? So the question of China becoming much more powerful shaper of the order is quite an alarming one if you're a believer in the liberal side. I do realize I'm going on a little bit, so I'm going to finish my remarks by saying that Michito also mentioned the TPP-11, which, of course, the UK has indicated interest in that. We are still interested in a lot of things. It depends who's interested in us. However, I think the UK, although we are on one knee at the moment, I should remind the audience that we're around the 5th or 6th largest GDP. We have a defense industrial base that is at capacity double the size of Russia's at capacity. We have an excellent university system. I think we're We're maybe having troubles at the moment, but I'm well, hopeful and positive that we will find a way out of this muddle. The question, of course, and people say it all the time, we debate it in London, is political will and resources. So will the UK continue to be a pillar of the rules-based international system, along with countries like Sweden, our European friends and allies and partners, with our newly renewed relations in Asia? Or will we find ourselves creating a new anti-liberal order, one where authoritarianism is made safe? And this is the real question of what kind of order we will be going into. It will be a contested order, and I think really this is the debate I would like to lay before you, and with that I'll cease my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two very good statements, and you mentioned a lot of things that we can continue to discuss. And I would like to begin by turning to Professor Tsuruoka and ask you if you could somehow elaborate a bit more on what Dr. Hemmings said about the threats that are imminent. For instance, in Japan, how do you define the Chinese threat? Is China a threat to Japan?
Thank you very much. Of course, many people believe that China is a threat, but the government officially has never called China a threat. It's a source of concern, and coming from the various problems like lack of transparency in the defense budget and the military build-up and the assertive behaviors in the East China Sea as well as South China Sea. So yes, those are very much source of concern. And from a Japanese point of view, of course, we have to deal with those threats and challenges. That's for sure. But the one thing I wanted to add is that North Korea is still the most imminent threat for Japan. Yes, now because of the political rhetoric of the denuclearization, or even Trump said that he fell in love with Kim Jong-un, and that period may be already over, but still, for Japan, particularly sitting in the same region, we have to look at capabilities rather than just willingness or intention on the North Korean side. So as long as capability is there, I mean the ballistic missiles and the nuclear weapons, then for us, for Japan, we need to deal with that. So yes, the long-term concern, the bigger concern, is of course China, but still in the short term, we should not forget about North Korea.
And Dr. Hemmings, in what way do you think that the UK can assist in protecting the liberal order in East Asia? Is the UK, especially after Brexit, is the UK looking at East Asia as a region that you would like to cooperate with?
I'm glad you asked me that. Let me just pull up my list of... I mean, there are a number of things that we can do and that we already are doing. A lot of the order, to some extent, relies on a military balance. So the UK is partnering very carefully with a number of regional states. As we saw, we also had 3 ships transit the region, with the last one, the HMS Albion, carrying out a type of freedom of navigation maneuver to perhaps not oppose Chinese sovereign claims, but certainly to oppose Chinese interpretations of international law and requirements and duties of those ships transiting what we perceive to be international waters. So that was quite brave. I think we're the only other state to have done one. And of course we were slapped down by the PRC, which told us that a FTA, a free trade agreement, would be at risk. But we did it anyway. And we're also trying to engage closely with our Chinese partners, trying to explain to them why it's in also their interest to follow the rules-based system, just purely out of self-interest, that if we renew a power-based system, actually it's in their advantage for the moment, but that, at any point, if they were to enter waters that are further afield, they may have to also challenge wider scopes of maritime claims. The UK is also beginning to think about, I'll end on this, the Indo-Pacific framework. Michito mentioned that the region has begun to develop its own understanding of how to think about itself. China still talks about the Belt and Road Initiative, but the region is beginning to talk about the Indo-Pacific. And of course we heard Trump mention it, but it goes before Trump. It's Japanese and Indian in origin. And ASEAN, recently the Indonesians have put their money into the Indo-Pacific concept. So regional countries are beginning to think about the region in a more inclusive manner. And I think what the UK can do next is by contributing to that multilateral, inclusive framework, rather than only supporting the kind of Chinese all belts lead to Rome.
Let's say if we in 10 years come to the point where we think that everything went wrong, what would you say would be the factors that caused everything to go wrong globally? I mean, it's a small subject, but...
So start humble.
But the factors that we have to look out for, you mentioned investments in Chinese investments in Europe have caused some concern. Mm. You mentioned Russian cyber attacks and so forth. I mean, if both of you could comment on the real threats that we should, to the liberal international order, that we should really be carefully looking at, not just talking about the expansion of their influence, but specific subjects that we should be concerned with.
So I suppose I always think that we should allow for the international system to be evolved. Why shouldn't China have a role? Of course they should. But it should be evolution, not revolution. In other words, once you start bringing military coercion into the game, then I think that's a big deal. And I think because we're dependent on Chinese investment and trade, we haven't really confronted the PRC with what it's done in the South China Sea. Now, it's a contested issue, but let's just put it this way. Imagine you have a highway that all of us use. All of us depend on it, and we all get income from it, everyone in this room. And one guy decides to build a toll, and he says it's always been in his backyard and he's going to do it. And everyone kind of quietly goes along with it because he's the richest guy on the road. That's kind of what's happened, and we haven't really diplomatically confronted China on it. The other thing is that we're allowing ourselves more to be, and I suppose this sounds a bit professionally paranoid, but I think the audience will forgive me on this. We've allowed ourselves to be completely open and free market with countries that have state-owned enterprises that are behaving in deeply centralized strategic manners. They're buying up newspapers that I write for a newspaper that has a very heavy dependence on Chinese income. I try to write freely on China with them, and occasionally they let me publish an article, but occasionally they say, no, Taiwan's off the rack. So we need to fight back, I think, not so much just in the rules-based order, but fight at home for our own institutions first, and show the Chinese, like when they did the secret deal with the Australian provincial government. I forgot which one it was. It was non-transparent. The Australians were livid, the central government. Of course they were. A provincial government asked to do a secret trade deal with China. That should be shut down immediately. Imagine if we were to go to a Chinese province and say, we want to do a secret trade deal with you without Beijing being involved. Can you imagine the response? So I think there needs to be reciprocity in relations, and that starts in investment, and it starts in rules of the road abroad.
Professor Tsuruoka.
From my point of view, I'm getting more and more concerned about the economic tensions between the US and China. And that could affect various other countries, not just the United States and China themselves. So European companies and the Japanese companies are already being affected. So the United States and China are big enough to destroy the whole free trade system, multilateral free trade system. So the biggest and the second biggest the economies in the world. So we should not overestimate, we should not underestimate the seriousness of this. And coming back to Join's point about the need to fight back. Yes, they're from time to time on serious issues, and if and when Russians or Chinese or whoever cross our red lines, then we need to be prepared to fight back. But in so doing, we need to take risks. Mm-hmm. So there's no risk fight back against China or Russia, because they are prepared to take risks. Then, for us to be able to fight back against them, then we will also need to be prepared to take risks. And what risks? If you're talking about security and defense things, then it could be a security and defense risks, which means we might have to end up using forces. But this is also the part of the picture, because in Chinese picture and the Russian picture, it's always been there, the use of force. And of course, the Russians look more prepared to use force than Chinese. But still, the Chinese have been doing various salami slicing and other things. And maybe Chinese are not quite killing people, unlike Russians. But still, we cannot rule out that. And one of the biggest reasons why China has been quite assertive in South China Sea is that they know that we are not prepared to fight back in South China Sea. So the situation is very asymmetric. So how we can redress that, it's something that we need to think about. Of course, it's not something quite easy for us to take, I think, but that's I think the reality.
Thank you very much. I think I see already hands moving in the audience. So I'd like to turn to the audience and say that the floor is open for questions and comments. And we'll start with one there, and then the ambassador in the back. And if you could state your name and affiliation, and if you don't want to do that, well, this is a free country. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Uno Svedin, Stockholm University, Stockholm Resilience Center, etc. Thanks a lot. Really interesting. I will pick the terminology from Dr. Hemmings, but it also pertains to your presentation, Professor. And it's the word contested, and in the combination contested order. Let's try a little scenario of the degree. If you have a curve, time curve, and you have the degree of the contestedness, my bet would be that the curve seems that is going up. So now the question is, what is the profile of that scenario of contestedness in volume and its sort of distribution of the essences of the contestedness? Sort of where will we have contestedness in the international order, and what is the time development of that scenario?
Do you want to wait for the next question and take two questions?
However you like. Did you have an answer to that?
Not quite.
Oh, yeah, we'll think about it. It's a difficult one.
So,
And
Ambassador,
I congratulate you on it.
Enrique Borges, Ambassador of Portugal, thank you very much for your presentations. I don't want to sound provocative, I don't even like the word, but I would like to ask you, taking up from the title of the conference, was there truly ever, except maybe in the post-war years, a true multilateral rules-based international system? Let me just cite a few decisions to question that. And I would start by the decision by the Nixon administration, as you know, in the early 70s to decouple the US dollar from gold. That was a unilateral decision. If we go then to the 90s, I was there at my delegation to NATO, and I remember very vividly how the decisions were taken regarding the former Yugoslavia, the intervention of NATO in the former Yugoslavia. This is no criticism, but as you know very well, this decision was taken without a mandate from the Security Council. Then we can go on and mention Iraq, other decisions. So my question is, how far there was a true international rules-based multilateral system? And don't take this as a provocation.
No, it's a good question. It's
Thank you.
in vogue in London as well.
Or do take it as a provocation.
Should we try those? Because I might forget actually the order
Why
of
not?
them.
Yeah.
So actually they're kind of related. And Patrick Porter, who is a British, he's Australian, but he's based in University of Birmingham, has approached the last question very headstrong in a great International Affairs article. I think it's International Affairs. And he also contests that there was ever a rules-based order. So I have a model of the rules-based order, which I kind of created for my last report, which essentially is an onion. And if you think about the Renaissance Italy, how it developed kind of diplomatic practice, right? That you have a diplomatic bag, that if you break a treaty, there's a kind of social punishment of that, right? You have that very, essential European-created diplomatic stuff at the heart of the Westphalian system. That's the very center of probably how states interact. If you overlay that with a bit of Grotius, some of the international law, for example, freedom of the seas, some of that nascent early international law stuff, then you have the UN system developed after 1945, which you have all the various institutions. So you sent a letter to the United States. How come the post office in America accepted it? Or your flight was able to land without some sort of... there's so many different little systems that keep all of the parts working that you can point to instances where the US has not done the right thing or someone has not obeyed the right system. But actually, it's a very, very complex system. So say you have the ICJ, the ICC on that next level. Those are the kind of pseudo-neo-international legal bodies that try to govern states. Then on top of that, you have the new neoliberal stuff, the kind of WTO, which actually has very strict, kind of obligations in terms of resolving disputes. So actually, I think, humans are great. We've done amazing things with the rules-based order. The liberal side of it came very much after the Cold War, and I think you're right about that being challenged. Liberalism is always in contest with national interest amongst democracies. The United States looks at certain issues and decides whether, it's impelled by its own sense of ideology or by its national interest. And sometimes those things are in harmony and sometimes they're not. So when the Americans mined the Nicaragua harbor, it wasn't particularly a good thing. The Trump administration's approach also shows that it doesn't like to be sovereign, to lose sovereignty to the UN. But I'd say that actually really the rules-based order, including the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of Seas, just go through the materials. You know better than I. There's heaps and heaps of materials that govern how states behave that you just to take for granted. And if we start unpicking them, like the PRC did with the 1997 declaration on Hong Kong, where they just said, we unilaterally reneged this treaty, that's the first. It's the first that you see someone just take a treaty, well, at least for a long time it's the first, and they just say, we renege on it. They walked back on it, by the way, privately. So I think I push back on this argument, but I agree with you. It wasn't liberal for much of the Cold War because the national interest was balanced. In terms of the first gentleman's question, I'll quickly... Do you want to take that one? Or
Yeah, please.
I'm on a roll or no? Yeah, to what degree? I mean, that's a really good question. I don't think the Russians and... so there's a joke going around that I hear, and I repeat it with kind of hesitation, that the Russians are breaking down the system while the Chinese are replacing it. That's the joke. It's not very funny, but the idea is that the Russians don't know what kind of order they want to create, but they're just not happy with this one. Whereas the PRC... if you follow Chinese international relations academia, there is some literature floating around about the revival of Tianxia, right? Under heaven, this kind of imperial Chinese concept, which has a hierarchical ordering, that China is at the center of a new kind of order, and that this kind of liberal system that the West built is more like a kind of chaos. It's not very orderly, it's not very tidy. And so I'm curious to see whether BRI and some of the China Dream stuff begins to impose a kind of a tributary system 2.0. Now, tributary system is not like direct imperialism. Foreign states still have sovereignty, but only on key issues. They don't have sovereignty over trade and foreign and defense policy. Those things would go to Beijing. So if we think about what kind of order is China going to build, look at its relations with debt diplomacy and with states in its near periphery for a clue of what they may try to build. I've talked too much.
Yeah. No. Starting with contestedness. The contestedness itself is not bad. It depends on contested over what. So if the object of contestedness is territory or territorial water, then it's a zero-sum game. So the contestedness is quite dangerous. But contestedness over wealth, fortune, then it's as long as it's a non-zero-sum structure, then it's just okay. And also my impression is that contestedness or contested domain, and these are the words that Americans like, and so talking about the cyber domain, a space domain, the contested domain, and the Americans often call. But I think now the interesting terminology is something that the Trump administration is using is the strategic competition. So that's not new, because in the 1980s, the Americans were talking a lot about strategic competition, of course vis-a-vis the Soviet Union at the time. But this return of the term strategic competition, this suggests that Americans are getting more prepared to see the current competition between the US and China as a long-term thing. Of course, the people are quite reluctant to use the term Cold War, because the current the nature of the relationship between the United States and China is quite different from that between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. But still, the strategic competition, I think this tells something that the Americans are getting more sort of prepared to see this a long-term thing rather than just a short-term conflict. Has there been ever rules-based, truly, really, a rules-based international order? Yes, that's a huge question. And I firmly believe that, as I said at the beginning, that the world has always been a jungle. So the like-minded countries, the United States, Europe, Japan, and some other countries, including, of course, Australia and others, have been trying to do is to regulate this jungle. And, of course, the United States played the biggest role following the end of the Second World War. And we are still benefiting from that basic structure. So the multilateralism or rules-based international order is always, at least in theory, it's always a strategy for the weak. Because the strongest power, they don't need rules. They are able to do whatever they want to do. So the rules-based international order works only when the strongest is prepared to follow the rules. And for that to happen, it's really important for the strongest power to believe that it's in their own interest to create more rules or follow the rules once those are established. So the challenge for us is reminding Americans that it is still in their own interest to maintain this order, something what Americans played the biggest role in creating after the war. So that is why I think it's too early to give up the U.S. international leadership. And I still firmly believe that it's in America's own interest to maintain this order. Yeah, because Americans are all also that those who benefited quite a lot from this system. And that was why they, at the beginning, they established this system.
Japan is sometimes accused of following rather than leading. Do you think that Japan has to change its international behavior and lead more than it has done in the past?
Yes, because I think TPP-11, I think it's a very good example of Japan's taking the lead. So when President Trump announced his decision his intention to withdraw from the original TPP, yes, we were quite shocked, but we changed our minds and then took the lead in persuading other countries to sort of salvage the TPP, and now it's highly likely to come into force at the end of this year, and so this is quite an achievement, and this shows that Japan can do something, but still, Japan cannot fill all the vacuum that is created by the sort of a U.S. retreat from the central stage of international leadership. Because it's just a reality that comparing the United States and Japan, the size is quite different. So Japan cannot hope to replace the United States in international relations. No. It's not what we expect and what we are trying to do. That's not the case. But still, together with other countries like European countries, the EU and Australians and others, there are various things we can do. So particularly in the international trade system and also the climate change, so how to salvage the Paris Accord is also something. But the biggest question is that when it comes to security and defense, the hard security and military things, as I said, that there's no plan B. And that reality remains quite true. And that is why when it comes to security and defense, we still very much rely on the United States. But still I believe that the security and the defense engagement and commitment, particularly to the Asia-Pacific region, and also for NATO as well, is in America's own interest as well.
Can I say something? I think you're being too modest. I think Japan has had a very instrumental role in one of the largest geopolitical debates, and that's the Indo-Pacific. The debate of who will lead Asian architecture, China or India, Japan very much put that agenda on the table with Abe's speech in New Delhi, and he's driven the Americans in that direction, the Australians in that direction. So actually the great debate of tomorrow will be China or India, and that conversation was definitely started by Japan, Abe in 2007 and 2008. So yeah, I think you played a very instrumental role.
Yeah. It's quite true. So Indo-Pacific is something that, I'm a huge fan of that. Yeah. So, but still there as well, the U.S. role is still quite
instrumental. True.
Indispensable, I should say.
Thank you very much. We have a question in the back from Mr. Palmstierna.
My name is Rutger Palmstierna. I'm, as Ambassador of Vargö, also an old sinologist. I'm also a former diplomat, but not as Ambassador of Vargö, an ambassador. I became a banker. But my question is a continuation. Actually, it emerged out of a discussion at a seminar at ISDP some years ago, where there were two Chinese naval officers present, and the discussion was about the Chinese activities in the South China Sea. And during that debate, these naval officers used terms like benevolence, loyalty, and so forth. Terms I recognize from earlier stages in Japan's history where they were used in the 30s. But also they have very strong Confucian connotations. And here is my question. Is China's Confucian value system compatible with the principle of equality between sovereigns of the Westphalian order?
Yeah. I'm not an expert on Confucius thinking, but I think what is more problematic is the China's more traditional worldview, the very hierarchical worldview, and that is not quite compatible with today's international order, based on international law, including the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And so the Asia is actually a maritime domain. So the importance of the freedom of navigation is really important in Asia. And to what extent China can understand that. That is a huge headache for us. But a bit sort of a small dose of hope is that China is becoming big and Chinese Navy is becoming more engaged in the wider world. So Chinese PLA Navy is becoming more like a blue water Navy and doing counter-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden and other places. They are active. And then some optimists say that based on those experiences, Chinese are now learning the importance of the freedom of navigation. And that sort of a learning curve happened for the Soviet Navy in the 1950s and 60s. But we are not quite sure that the Chinese learning curve is to be like the Soviet learning curve of the 1950s and 60s. So because in areas close to mainland China, the Chinese are more serious about claiming sovereignty or their territories, the nine-dash line and whatever, whereas in further afield, far away regions like the Gulf of Aden or Mediterranean, Chinese behave more like good international citizen. So for Japan as well, it's easier to cooperate with Chinese in Africa, for example. And that's something that when Prime Minister Abe visited Beijing last month, there we talked a lot about Sino-Japanese cooperation in what we call third countries, meaning that in East China Sea, it's almost impossible for us to cooperate, but in other regions, it's more likely for us to cooperate. So looking at the China's sort of the basic logic of dealing with international issues, I think there is a sort of a gap or distinction between what Chinese are doing in the Western Pacific region, in the immediate neighborhood, on the one hand, and on the other, in Africa and other areas. So coming back to your question, then looking at the immediate neighborhood of China, then it's quite easy to see that the Chinese don't think Southeast Asian countries as equal sovereign state, and in terms of capability, so the South China Sea conflict and the Philippines, the naval capability is almost nothing seen from Beijing. So there is in the first place, a hierarchical view, and that is very much supported or reinforced by the power gap between China and the Philippines. So this is not quite the optimistic situation.
Nothing to add.
Optimistic?
Nothing to add. No, my only recommendation is if anyone's interested in Chinese conceptions of order, there's a great professor at the LSE who wrote China Dreams, which has 10 different international relations scholars in China and how they conceive of a future Chinese-centric order. I don't know if it's in Swedish, it's definitely in English, but that's where I had my first encounter with Tian Sha and his discussion of that from the conservative side of those IR writers. So I recommend that.
Do I have any more questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Mark Taylor. I work at the British Embassy here in Stockholm. The rules-based international order sounds a little bit like the domestic situation at home. My wife and I have a pretty good bilateral agreement on what the rules should be in our household. My children have an entirely different view on it. I think we're quite clear between the two of us where we would like the line to be on their behaviour. The question for me, both at home and in the international space, is about the tools available for enforcing that, for ensuring adherence to it. So my question to you both is what you think are the most effective tools, bearing in mind what you've said about the most difficult challenges, particularly in the security space, and how perhaps only the most powerful country or the most powerful countries will always do what they want regardless.
I think, if I may, it's a really excellent question. And it is, especially for countries like the UK and Sweden, and multilateral groupings like the EU, a very difficult challenge because we can be broken up by larger powers, as we've seen China do with the 16+1, and they can engage and use investment as a tool to weaken our will. So if you think about those kids going to mother and asking for a different rule. So there's a domestic game at play as well in how we relate to the rules-based order. I think my sense is that, for example, when Theresa May went to Beijing last, and of course, you know, the inevitable outstretched hand for investment, it has to be there. I can't say that she's any different from the Americans or the French. But I suppose what we could do is we could still message. I think what's the trouble is that we've gone quiet, or we're willing to do it behind closed doors. And I think it's because we're afraid of being punished. We're afraid we won't get 5 billion, we'll get 4.5 billion. We'll lose a little bit. And I think it's a face issue for the Chinese, and we're too sensitive to that. We're so sensitive to Chinese face that we lose sight of our wider national interests. So I think more public messaging. I think there's another thing which is extremely controversial, but I'll put it out there, which is multilateral messaging, where, for example, when these islands were being built, you know, imagine if the European Union had issued a very strong statement, or if G7, after the Permanent Court of Arbitration, essentially had come out and said something very strong. I'm not sure that the PRC would have stopped their behavior, but they would have known where the line was. The moment we're giving the shop away. So I don't know that we can stop and use our own coercive power, but we can use our discursive power. We can put these issues in the public light and make the PRC think about our own views. Whether or not we're able to even muster diplomatic groupings in order to punish the Chinese, I think is beyond, as you and I know, we're far too easily fragmented to do something so bold as that. But just, you know, messaging, if, for example, Sri Lanka turned into a real coup, and it looked really like the Chinese had overturned a government, you know, if the Indians decided to step up the plate and do something about it, that we would step in with them, and that we would get, you know, a group of states to vocalize that opposition. That would be extremely small, but huge at the same time. So that type of, I think, collective messaging is where we're very weak, and you know, good for China. They can absolutely maximize their gains, and we do nothing about it because they know which domestic investment buttons to push. So we have to start thinking a bit more strategically and worry a little bit less about damaging Chinese face, as much as we love them, but it's just, otherwise there won't be an international system to defend. Do you have...
Yeah, collective messaging, yes, that's really important, because the Chinese often want to portray their problems as a bilateral Sino-Japanese or Sino-American problems. That Japanese or Americans are not prepared to accept the reality that China is rising. To some extent, maybe a little bit true. But the reality is much more complicated and much more nuanced. So I think what is really important in terms of thinking about giving a message to Beijing is that it's not just about China and Japan and China and the United States. Other countries are also watching what the Chinese are doing. So in that context, I remember that 2 years ago, there was a G7 summit in Japan, Iseshima G7 summit, where we managed to adopt a very strong declaration and statement about the South China Sea and the maritime security issues. And the Chinese reaction to that was really harsh. So they called the G7 ambassadors and they made a formal protest. Of course, in public, the Chinese at the time said that, oh, this is just a piece of paper, we don't care. But if they didn't really care, then they wouldn't call the ambassadors to make protests. So the Chinese reaction told us that Chinese care, that sort of things. So G7 or whatever, the multilateral statement condemning or showing or expressing concerns, that's really important. So that's one thing. Still the multilateral. I sort of envy that European countries have a very established multilateral framework, both the EU and NATO, because in Japan in Asia, we have to deal with China on a bilateral basis, the United States. It's an ally, but it's a bilateral setting. And one of the reasons why we have been quite committed to TPP was that it was a good idea to involve Americans in a multilateral setting. And many Japanese have been very much fearful of a bilateral trade talks between Japan and the United States. Yes, we are now about to start the negotiations, but our impression has always been that dealing with Americans in a bilateral setting on trade issues is more difficult than using multilateral framework. So the U.S. is there as well, and China, and Russia. So Japan has to deal with those countries in bilateral contexts. So of course, the EU always has a challenge of speaking in one voice, and that's a huge challenge, and particularly vis-à-vis China and vis-à-vis Russia. But still, you have established framework, and so that's why. But now the UK is leaving the EU, so you are brave enough to try to deal with international dodgy leaders or dodgy
still
powers.
In NATO.
Oh, we're still in NATO. That's good.
We haven't left every group.
Yeah. So that's I think one of the very important structural differences.
Lately in Sweden, we've had many incidents where criminals are killing each other and taking revenge, and there's a shooting. And I wonder if you could say something about the threat to the liberal order also from non-state actors, specifically criminal organizations, and perhaps also if you find cases or possibilities or threats from states and non-state actors cooperating in destroying the liberal order. Is that something that you can comment on, you think?
The obvious one is the quasi-government status of Chinese maritime militias. So that's been a really interesting phenomenon. A lot of people see the PLAN and the Coast Guard, but then there's also the fishing fleets, and of course they operate now with centralized control, so that's one form. But in terms of gangs, I suppose for me, rather than gangs, although it's of interest, it would be the non-state actors, I suppose, would be the old canard of spreading Islamic extremists propagating that type of influence and within the West. So in the UK, we had a number of attacks last year, and that continues to be an issue. And although it doesn't seem to be a direct challenge to the rules-based order, it is to some extent. It's a challenge to the liberal part of the rules-based order because I think, unfortunately for us, some of the responses that we have to take because of their attacks on a vulnerable part of society. You know, what do you do when people drive up and ram into people walking on the pavement? One of the things is figuring out legislation that continues to keep a liberal side of our society and rules-oriented so that our counterintelligence, counter-terrorist forces remain embedded in parliamentary oversight. That is a real challenge, I think, for us, a much greater challenge than we realize. I actually sympathize deeply for, not only the parliamentary overseers who must continue to watch our counterintelligence and our counter-terrorist forces, but they must not only do that to protect us, but to protect the way of life that we also stand for. It's a really difficult balance. And the fact that it's happening mostly inside the liberal states is also then kind of has impact on the remaining liberal aspects of the order. I mean, one thing I will say on this, we didn't mention before, but when we say, what does it mean to be liberal? Implicit in this kind of liberalness is not just democratic, but also a kind of multilateral institutions. And so I do think that we need to try to maintain those ideological components, normative components of the order while we're combating this ideological extremists within our societies.
And of course the terrorism is a huge concern for many countries. And luckily in Japan we haven't had the Islam-related extremism terrorist attacks, luckily. But in 2020 the Summer Olympic Games are coming. And before that, next year, we're going to host the Rugby World Cup. So the people say that world events bring world problems, and perhaps including terrorism as well. Of course, the cyber and other things as well. But those are the things that we need to be more vigilant. That's for sure. But I think looking at the broader picture here, I think we can now make an argument that there is perhaps a growing gap between American perceptions and European perceptions when it comes to the level of threat from non-state actors. Because they're looking at the national defense strategy of the United States, and it clearly says that the age of great power competition has come back. So the age of terrorism is over, and the strategic competition with China and Russia is now at the center of the stage. But still, looking at national security strategy of various European countries, still very much focusing on terrorism and non-state actors, or even organized crimes as a very top priority items for national security, including the UK, the National Security Strategy, and the SDSR as well. So how we can bridge the gap between these two diverging perceptions, I think that is becoming a challenge. So we have to think about this. And but Japan, actually, we have been very much focusing on state actors. So in that sense, might be in sync with Americans. Yeah. So that's a sort of a bit the broader picture.
Oh, good. I think a question here, and then the question. We take the two questions at the same time. Well, not at the same time, but after each other.
So, hello everyone. My name is Dag Helstenius, working with the Swedish Space Corporation, a state-owned company supporting ESA, JAXA, NASA, etc., with space services. My question would be, we have a consensus here that the liberal international order is being challenged both by the rise of China, notably, and also to some extent by Russia after the almost abdication of American leadership. I would appreciate it if you, both gentlemen, would develop some ideas on the differences, on the challenges which are posed by China and Russia, because from my perspective they could be different, and I think it's worthwhile developing a little bit on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And next question, please.
Hey, thank you for your talk. It's very interesting, very informative. My name is Maximilian Menhardt. I'm an intern at ISDP currently in the Silk Road Studies program. Regarding Lars' last question on the threat of non-state actors to liberal order, I was surprised that you mentioned first terrorism and Islamic ideology together with that. But what is about far-right radicalization and nationalist movements, which are obviously a threat to the liberal order, maybe even a bigger one than terrorist organizations?
Thank you. Do you think you can?
Good range of questions, and a superb last question. My institute has lately begun to look at far-right terrorism, so I have to admit I'm not an expert on it, which is probably why I gave it less response in my answer. But you're right. I think there is a very interesting counter-globalization movement that's occurring, which also it's as ambiguous about the rules-based order as China and Russia seem to be, and I think that's deeply disturbing. As I pointed out, I don't have any answers for this, but I do have an analysis, and so you can draw from my analysis what you think. My interpretation of why we are where we are is that the Americans decided after Kissinger and Nixon moment to essentially bring the Chinese into the order, and the best way to do that would be beneficial for Western companies would be to use China's manufacturing capacity and create a kind of consumer-driven society, which would be amazing for the global economy. And actually they were very successful in large part in that achievement over the 30 years that we're discussing. But of course, simultaneously, post-1990s, they also began to open up borders and bringing in, I guess, migrant labor, you would say, which I think offset against the shipment of factories to China, really put tension on the working classes. So the figures are now not disputed, but there's good analyst at MIT, and I've forgotten his name for the moment, who looks at the number of jobs that were migrated to the US. Now everyone says, no, all the jobs were taken by robots, blah, blah, blah. Apparently there's been some proper analysis, and something like 5 million jobs went to China from the US manufacturing sector alone. Now how many of those would have just disappeared anyway, we don't know. There's a good counter-argument there. But what it did was essentially, if you're in the white-collar sectors, you did very well, because especially if you own these companies that were suddenly making widgets in China for much cheaper. But if you were working class, either in the UK or with suddenly Polish and Romanian guys who were competing for jobs for very much cheaper, and I'm not saying that migration was a bad thing, I'm just pointing out the fact that this is the impact it had on the working class. And now the working class have reacted by telling us, people like myself who are cosmopolitan elites who weren't suffering from this great globalization experiment and process post-state thing with China, they're telling us to correct it. And they're running back to the old culture, because the migration issue not only threatens their jobs and livelihood, but it also introduces a kind of a cosmopolitanness that feels threatening to their culture. They're running to that direction, and also they're running to some extent to the far left. So that's why we had the Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn have also become, we've seen the revival of kind of, workers' rights and workers' parties, which is really unusual, given that the Soviet-era ideology has been shown to fail. So where are we with this? I mean, Trump himself is if I'm half American and I go to the US a lot, and he was, working class people tell me, oh, he's the working class president. Now, this is a conservative. So you have, it seems to me, I think globalization from the post-1990s, I think we got it wrong. I don't know why. I think we did a very noble thing, especially in terms of trying to bring China into the system, and I don't think we were very morally correct in trying to do that. But the impact, the consequences of that on our own societies was to massively attack the lower middle and working classes. And if you look at the actual squeeze that they get, you can see it's very clear. Now add on to that the tech bubble and the digital billionaire classes that also rose on the new technologies. So you have a completely new type of economy which the manufacturing classes couldn't compete with, and that makes it even worse. So I know the analysis. I don't know what the solution is. I really, we had this kind of similar stage in the 1930s where you saw the middle kind of idea, the Blairites and the kind of Hillary Clinton Democrats go completely, they lost power, and you saw the far right and far left begin to develop, better traction because they were attacking that status quo. So where do we go? I think we probably need to bring some jobs home. I'm not a protectionist, but I do think we need to look after our own countries, and we can't just continually offshore jobs without any impact. But how do we do that in a responsible way and remain a free market state is an answer that's beyond my understanding. But I bet you $1 million, all of our countries in the European Union, and some of us not, will continue to debate the social evolution of that really essential question. And I hope to some extent that Michito will answer your one, because that one really got me going. I can't talk too much.
Yes, starting with the second question. I fully agree that the rise of populism, nationalist movement, far-right movement, and that is a bigger threat to the rules-based international order. That's for sure, compared to terrorism and other things. That destroys the domestic foundation for our countries, the commitment to international order. And I think there is a big danger that people are becoming more inward-looking. So looking inward, it's a very easy thing for many people. Yeah, because we don't want to be too much engaged in areas far away from our homeland. So the Afghanistan, Iraq, yes, I very much appreciate that the various countries they're committed to those operations, and it was really a responsible decision for those governments. But for ordinary people, it's very hard to understand why we need to be engaged in faraway places. So in the Asia-Pacific region as well, the ordinary Americans, those who have never traveled abroad, it's just impossible for them to understand why Americans need to be engaged in Japan or the Western Pacific region, which is too far away from where many people live in the U.S. But what I think is really important is to remind ourselves that the extent and how we are dependent on what's taking place outside the country. So our prosperity, not just our prosperity, but also our security, are very much dependent on what takes place in sometimes faraway regions. So the South China Sea. For many Japanese, South China Sea is too far away. But the Japan's security and Japan's prosperity are very much dependent on maintaining the freedom of navigation and the sea lines of communication there, and Indian Ocean as well. So I think it's really important to keep trying to remind people that how dependent we are on things taking place in other parts of the world. But still, of course, that's very easy to say, but it's really easy to change people's minds. But that's not a good reason for us to stop trying. So we need to keep trying this. And particularly for Japan, it's still a substantial, the third largest economy in the world. It's a substantial country, 120 million people there. So for many people, it's just a comfortable place. So it's not quite easy to understand how dependent we are on the things taking place outside the country. Comparing Russia and China, yes, that's really a very important question. Of course, the obvious difference is that whereas Russia is a declining power, China is a rising power. But still, Russia can do a lot of things because Russians are far more prepared to use what they have, including the use of force. So the Russians are far more prepared to use force, and that has been demonstrated in various parts of the world, including the eastern part of Ukraine, Syria, and other places as well. Of course, in Crimea, they didn't actually use force, but they showed force. And the Chinese, at least so far, have been more cautious and less prepared to use force, but they have been showing forces and changing the status quo by force. May not be the use of force as such, but coercion has been there. So yes, the Chinese are watching, have been trying to learn lessons from Russia's various experiences of use of force or coercion in Ukraine or in Syria and other parts of the world. So far, Russians have been far more prepared to use force compared to Chinese, but we cannot be certain whether this difference is going to continue. And someone living in Asia, yes, there we would very much expect Chinese to remain cautious in using force, but this is a huge challenge. So how we can prevent the Chinese from getting more prepared to use physical force, that's really a huge question. And I don't have an answer to that, but that's a big challenge.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid our time's up, and we have to conclude this seminar, but it has been extremely interesting. Thank you for all the good questions, but most of all, thank you for what you gentlemen gave us in the form of information and good statements. I'd like to ask you to thank the two gentlemen in the way that we are so good at, namely by applauding.